and I was taken into the foster care system in LA. And I was 3 years old at this point. The standard approach is, let's move the kid around a lot, because if he gets too attached to any one foster home, a parent re-enters the picture, the kid isn't going to want to go back with their mother or their father, and that never happens. But of course, this creates an extreme instability for a kid.
If I was just going to be devil's advocate, I would say, Rob, you are a classic example of a meritocracy actually working.
There are limits to this meritocracy idea. I ended up okay, but none of my 5 friends went to college. 2 of them went to prison. 1 of them was shot to death. What the military taught me was motivation is just a feeling. Discipline is, I'm going to do this regardless of how I feel.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. Today, friend of the show, my friend, and very interesting author, Rob Henderson, is with us. For those who are fans of the podcast, you've heard Rob several times before. Rob, welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about your new book, which is released, yes? Or
it'll be out February 20th.
February 20th. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the title of the book is essentially Trouble, a memoir of foster care, family, and social class. Let me start out by saying I know a lot of this, and I had the privilege of seeing the galleys of the book. Mm-hmm. I think it's a tremendous book. I recommend that everyone read the book. With that out of the way, let's start with your experiences in foster care were really harrowing. When I read the book, it was like, holy shit. So for our listener and viewers' benefit, can you maybe take us through the story a little bit? Now, obviously not you don't have to recite the entire book, but give us a picture of what that looked like, and also how it shaped your views on family stability, which we're going to come to later.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jim. I mean, so I just realized, so this is my 4th time on this show. I remember we spoke a few years ago about luxury beliefs, and then we've done a couple with Trung, our friend Trung Fan, and it's 4th time.
You're becoming a regular. You're a regular, man.
A regular. Yeah. I'm a big fan of the show too. So yeah, this is I mean, I've been working on this book now. It's been sort of 5 years in the making. And yeah, I will say that those early chapters, I think the first half of the book, I mean, those were the hardest to write. I mean, which is kind of, it's not surprising because, the last few years of my life have been really great. But the first half of my life or so has been less than optimal. And so especially those early years, I describe being born into poverty in Los Angeles, never knowing who my father was, my birth mother, and I, she and I were homeless for a while when I was very young. When I was a baby, we lived in a car for some time. We eventually settled in this slum apartment in LA, and my mom was just, eventually became very addicted to drugs, neglectful, unable to care for me. Eventually, some neighbors called the police, and they saw the state of our apartment and, the neglect and everything that was occurring there. And so my mom was arrested, and I was taken into the foster care system in LA. And I was 3 years old at this point. And so, I sort of opened the book with this story and how I'd lived in 7 different homes over the next 5 years or so, all around Los Angeles. Some of these homes that I moved into had upwards of 8 or 10 kids. I just remember just sort of, these homes were, because the system is overburdened. I mean, there aren't that many, people who are interested in being foster parents, and there's just a lot of kids who need homes. And so, I stay in a bunk bed with 3 or 4 kids to room in some cases. Later, I was placed into a foster home, but the last home that I stayed in before I was adopted, where I was the only kid. And, it was weird. Either way, it was unpleasant, because in the one case, when I had lots of foster siblings, it was just like a fight all the time for basically every kind of resource: attention, food, care, attention, everything. clothes. But then later, when I was in that one home where there were no kids, I just remember being lonely. And the foster mother who was responsible for me was just kind of cold and indifferent toward me. And it would have been nice, I remember thinking in that case, it would have been nice to have some kids around, some other kids. But yeah, it was hard. I mean, with all the foster siblings, I guess one thing that people don't often think about with the foster system is, like, not only are you as a child being frequently moved to different homes, which is hard enough, but then you're also seeing your foster siblings constantly removed from you. So you may build a bond, you may develop a friendship with one of the kids, and then maybe their mom sobers up or their dad re-enters the picture. Some relative decides that they can take care of the kid. And so then the kid is taken. Oftentimes, not often, but occasionally they will return because their mom relapsed or because their dad was arrested or something along those lines. And so it was just a lot of uncertainty and instability in day-to-day life when I was in these homes. Some people have asked me, so again, I never knew my father. My mother was deported. So she was from South Korea. She was from Seoul. She came to the US as a young woman. I didn't know my father's background, his ancestry, until later. I took a 23andMe test recently and got my results. And it turns out my dad was Mexican. He was Hispanic. And I went my whole life, the first 32 or 33 years of my life, not knowing this about myself. And so people have asked me, like, why is it that you were moved all the time? Like, you didn't have any relatives who could re-enter the picture, who could come care for you. Why were they moving you to different homes? One reason for this is that essentially when a kid is frequently relocated to different homes, the idea is to reduce the likelihood of any issues of attachment or loyalty. So the standard approach is, let's move the kid around a lot, because if he gets too attached to any one foster home, a parent re-enters the picture, the kid isn't going to want to go back with their mother or their father, whoever it is, because they've built this bond with the foster parents. Often the foster parents will become attached to the kid as well, and they're reluctant to let them go, especially if they know there's a high likelihood that the birth relatives aren't going to remain sober or in a position to care for the kid for very long. They know that it's not going to be maybe the best for the kid. And so they just move the kid a lot frequently, and that never happens. But of course, this creates an extreme instability for a kid. Maybe that strategy might work for kids who do have relatives who can re-enter the picture and care for them. But for someone like me, it was just needless. It was completely unnecessary. And it would have been better, I think, for them to, by the time I was, about a year before I was adopted, I saw we regularly had to get checkups, and the state ordered, you got to see a psychiatrist, you got to see a social worker, you got to see this person and that person and the other. There was a psychiatrist at the LA Children's Hospital who actually carefully reviewed my file, and he was like, wait, you don't have any parents. You shouldn't be moving to foster homes all the time. And so he made this recommendation, basically, we need to find a way to get this kid adopted, because there's no otherwise he's just going to be moving to different placements until he's 18. So then I was adopted by this family. We settled into this kind of dusty blue-collar town in Northern California called Red Bluff. And so, that was sort of the first, half or third of my childhood was the foster system. And then, moving into this with this family when I was 7. My 8th birthday was sort of just around the corner after I was adopted. But then I kind of got this, so I was adopted in the late 90s. And I guess one reason people have found kind of the second chapter onward of my book interesting is that I kind of got this glimpse into sort of what's been happening to kind of working class blue collar areas in America. And this is a segment of society that's often overlooked, which is, kind of the deterioration, the rising rates of single parenthood, of family instability, domestic abuse, strife, separations. Because I spend a lot of those chapters not only writing about my life and seeing my adoptive parents divorce and the kind of fallout as a result of that, but also my friends as well. I made 5 close friends in Red Bluff when I was growing up, and none of the 6 of us were raised by both of our parents. My other 5 friends grew up in kind of garden variety, broken homes, dysfunctional homes. I had 2 friends raised by single moms, 1 friend raised by a single dad. one friend who was raised by his grandmother because his dad was in prison and his mom was addicted to drugs. I had another friend who, was raised by his aunt, and then, he's kind of bounced around different relatives because none of them were really in a position to sort of provision prolonged care. And so that's like that's like a very common picture of what life is like in these sort of poor, impoverished communities. Poor in a kind of relative sense. I mean, that's something else that I point out in the book too, is like, we were poor by American standards, but it wasn't, sometimes I'm uncomfortable with using the word poor, that I grew up poor. It is true in the context of, a developed first world country, but it was more squalor. It was more just people who were a little bit materially impoverished, but mostly just making a lot of bad decisions and getting addicted to drugs, or just sort of being neglectful, or not really kind of unfocused, aimless. I mean, this was sort of the beginning, the early 2000s, the beginning of the opioid crisis. This was kind of the early years of the housing crash and the financial crisis. And, I was sort of seeing people make unwise financial decisions, personal decisions. And yeah, it affected me. It affected my adoptive sister. It affected my friends. And so I tell the story of how, yes, I had this very unusual and sort of positive upward trajectory, with some hiccups and some setbacks along the way. But generally, I ended up okay. But none of my 5 friends went to college. 2 of them went to prison. One of them was shot to death. I mean, that's like a normal, that's like the modal outcome. Like the best maybe you could expect under ordinary circumstances is kind of working a menial job and, staying out of trouble with the law or not getting killed. But otherwise, that's a very common sort of outcome. And so I'm in a position to tell those stories. No one's going to give my high school friends, no one's going to give them a book deal. So I thought it was important also to describe those outcomes as well, because I really didn't want this to be that kind of typical, just work hard and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and anything's possible. Those things are important. I do make the point that hard work wasn't, like, I couldn't have got where I am today without hard work, but there are so many other factors at play in terms of what predicts social mobility and how to get out of a really sort of chaotic and disorderly environment when you're a kid or a teenager. So anyway, that's like the very short version of this, but yeah, happy to go wherever you want to go from there.
I mean, there's just so much to unpack there. Like, the policy decisions of moving kids around, like that conflicts with everything, at least that I'm familiar with in looking at early childhood development. That the fear of abandonment, the fear of rejection, those are things that, like Tim Leary said, that we got imprinted at a very young age, and you are either imprinted with a winner. This is his term, so from the 70s, long time ago. So he used pretty direct words. He said, before the age of 5, you're imprinted with a winner script or a loser script. Yes. You're imprinted with top dog or bottom dog. And part of his work that actually is very compelling and is supported and replicated in more traditional psychological research finds that, all of the things that you experience are really detrimental to the development of a child. And so, like, the first thing I'd ask about is, I hope that isn't like an intentional thing, right? Like you said, on the face of it, I guess I could say, yeah, I understand that idea that if the actual parent comes back, you wouldn't want the child to be, resistant to going with their actual parent. And so I understand the logic, but was there a lot of research put into it, or did that system just develop the way it developed?
I think it was more of an organic, people not really thinking through. I definitely don't think it was malicious in intent. Probably people making sort of short-term convenient decisions and maybe sort of reverse, reverse justifying it, backwards engineering it to make sense, to make it palatable. There's a line I quote in my book from the Yale sociologist and physician Nicholas Christakis, who comes up in the book later as well. But one of the points he makes in his book Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, which is a great book, he describes how, I'm paraphrasing, but basically every innovation and every policy around childcare in the United States has basically been catered toward the interests of adults, and what was important for kids is usually secondary. Which, in a way, it's sad, but it makes sense because adults are the ones with the political power and the ability to implement policy, and kids are, they're naive, they're unsophisticated, they don't have political power, and so, if they have a preference for, actually, I'd rather just be adopted because my parents are not in a position to care for me, they just don't have the ability to make that happen. And so it's, social workers, and it's the system, it's, everyone involved in the foster care bureaucracy, making a series of decisions. And often the people who make decisions are kind of far removed from what's happening on the ground in these homes. And so, yeah, I mean, if anything, things might actually be worse now than they were when I was going through in the late 90s. I hope they're not, but I've heard, like the number of kids entering care is skyrocketing, especially in the wake of the opioid crisis, and just it's easier now than it was, 25 or 30 years ago to access drugs and all these kinds of things. And so, a lot of kids are being neglected, and that's usually the main reason. I mean, I think people wonder, why do kids enter care? And usually the number one reason is neglect, more so than active abuse. Most parents do care about their kids. They don't actively want to harm them, but it's more so maybe their reward centers of their brain get hijacked by drugs, or they're suffering from mental illness, but often the mental illness is triggered by use of substances. And so, yeah, the kid just sort of finds themselves that was like the usual story. I remember talking to my foster siblings about this, about, why are you here? What happened? Usually, yeah, my mom got into trouble or my dad got arrested. And it wasn't like they were hurting the kid. It was more just they were distracted by other things. And so then, teacher or a neighbor or someone called the police, and, they entered the system in that way.
Another view that I think people might be surprised by is, you mentioned that you're Korean and Latin, but Charles Murray wrote a book called "Coming Apart: The State of White America, 1960 through 2010," and if anything, things have gotten worse since he wrote that book. And so it seems to me that this isn't like a racial thing at all. This affects every color, every race. And there's kind of a universal finding that a lot of this really needs an incredibly significant overhaul. Do you see that as being even a possibility?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so yeah, the point is right that, so in the foster homes I grew up in, it was like, most of my foster parents were, so this was Los Angeles. So it was, a lot of sort of, Hispanic or Filipino families that were taking us in. And then, my foster siblings, a lot of them were Hispanic or Black, and some white kids, handful of Asian kids, but mostly Southeast Asian or South Asian. But like it was, when I got to Red Bluff is way north. It's like 2 hours north of Sacramento. It's a part of California very few people visit or even know about. And it's much more rural, much more blue collar area. And it was, when I was growing up, it was probably like maybe 65-35 or 70-30 white to Hispanic. And yeah, it was not like a racial, because you saw like the middle class Hispanic families were intact and they were fine, but it was the sort of the more working class ones that were having difficulty. And same with the white families too, but it was like mostly working class families there. And so the picture I described earlier of my friends, I had white friends and I had Mexican friends, and it was like, it wasn't that, it was kind of very similar across ethnic backgrounds. And so, is there a way to address it? I think it would take it would take a sort of complete transformation in terms of sort of what we're willing to talk about, as far as family and importance for kids. And, there's a lot of discussion of poverty and inequality, but a point that I make in the book is that, one of the findings that I found interesting, that I cite there is that the correlation between childhood family income and detrimental outcomes in adulthood, things like substance abuse or likelihood of incarceration, or committing crimes and acts of violence or self-defeating behaviors, drinking and driving, those kinds of things. The link between childhood poverty and those outcomes later in life, I mean, it's very tenuous. It's kind of inconsistent. Some findings show no significance whatsoever. Others show a very low correlation. However, when researchers look at childhood instability and those detrimental outcomes later in life, they find a strong and consistent effect across different studies. So this is a replicated finding. And so childhood instability is measured by things like frequency of relocation as a child. How many homes did you move into? How many people moved in and out of the homes that you lived in? So, did you have people sort of coming in and out throughout your life? Were your parents together? Were they divorced? Were they separated? How frequently did you sort of go back and forth if they were divorced? So just sort of day-to-day disorder and instability, especially, you mentioned earlier, the sort of first 5 to 7 years of life are critical, that developmental window. And so when researchers just look at instability during the first 5 to 7 years of life, the effect is the strongest, but it still remains significant, even if you just sort of measure throughout the entire person's upbringing from birth to age 18. And so, a point that I make is that, yes, we can address issues of poverty and material lack, but I also think we could be focusing on instability and trying to cultivate security for young kids too, especially during those first 5 to 7 years, to make sure that the kid feels, what did you mention, these scripts, right? To feel like, that they're not a loser, or that they're not going to engage in self-defeating behaviors, like that they're worthy of success. And I cite research from the Nobel laureate James Heckman, who's done research on comparing the US and Denmark in terms of social mobility. And he finds basically the rates of social mobility in Denmark are roughly the same. And despite the fact that in Denmark, university education is free, and a lot of the sort of social welfare programs are easily accessible and more generous than they are in the US. But the social mobility rates for poor and working class kids in Denmark are indistinguishable from those in the US. And he points out that the family system for poor and working class people in Denmark are identical almost to the US in terms of rates of single parenthood and kids living in instability and squalor. And so if you have those very difficult early life experiences, you don't just magically turn 18 and someone says, hey, here's free tuition and go to university and your life's going to change. If you spent the first 18 years of your life sort of struggling and not forming good relationships with your family, with your friends, with people who want the best for you, you're not going to turn it all around just because you're suddenly an adult. And yeah, that's something that I discuss at length too. Is my friends, when we all graduated high school, a good number of them decided to go to community college, and they're like, oh, I'm just going to go to community college. I'll transfer to a 4-year university, and it's going to be great. And actually, their performance in community college was worse than it was in high school. And the reason is not that difficult to understand, which is that when we were all in high school, we actually had a little bit of oversight. We had parents. They weren't always the most involved, but they were around, and they would sort of make sure that we weren't completely going off the rails. But once you're 18, it's like all bets are off. It's like, if I want to skip class and just drink all day and get high in the parking lot and go play video games or get into trouble, no one can tell you that you can't do those things. And so, I have friends who are still to this day, like 33 years old, still in community college because they're just, they just can't quite get everything together. And so I still haven't quite figured out how you can spend 15 years in community college, but I have friends who, I don't know if you ever see that movie Van Wilder, Jim, but they're taking that to an extreme where they want to be in college forever. And so, yeah, it's anyway, yeah. So basically, yeah, the point being very extreme early life instability and all those things. I mean, it becomes hard later at the other side of age 18 to achieve upward mobility or those conventional metrics of success.
Yeah, and you're mentioning of the study between Denmark and the U.S. and social mobility is one that I've seen, And so obviously in your book, when I was reading the manuscript, I was very interested in that. And, it kind of makes, Murray makes the same case in his book. Essentially, the reason he started in 1960 was it was before all of the big social changes in America. And he pointed out, I think pretty convincingly, that the experience was not one of your socioeconomic class. It was of what kind of household you grew up in. And at the beginning of the book, he points out that in 1960, like, if you were poor, you were growing up in a two-parent household. And, the outcomes were far more similar back then. And then he zeroes in on single parenthood and that as one of the culprits. And I know that you address that as well.
Yeah, he writes that, and I mean, what's interesting about Murray's book is that he looks specifically at white Americans, right? Like, he looks at non-Hispanic U.S. whites, and he's fighting, all of the kind of social pathologies related to income, to class, to that divide. Yeah, that in 1960, 95% of U.S. children, regardless of their social class, were raised by both of their birth parents. And by 2005, for affluent, kind of upper class Americans, it had dipped slightly to 85%, but it's still the vast majority of affluent, kids born into affluent families raised by both birth parents. But for working class kids, kids who with parents who maybe worked blue collar jobs, who didn't go to university, didn't go to college, it dropped to 30%. And even that kind of struck me as high. I mean, so that was 2005. But yeah, I mean, I was a kid in 2005. I remember that era, and it still seemed more than I would have expected, because, yeah, it was just an anomaly where I grew up to see anyone raised by both of their birth parents. And so, yeah, obviously economics must play some non-zero, non-trivial role here, but there's something else going on with values, with where our priorities are, with, what people think of as a good life as far as cultural guardrails. A point that I've made a little bit in the book and then in my Substack and other pieces is that, if you're just a conscientious, academically oriented, kind of forward-thinking person, you don't need that much in the way of social values or norms or pressure. You don't need much social pressure. You can sort of figure out on your own, what's a good way to live life? What's the best sort of formation for my children? What do I want for my future? You can kind of, inch your way forward to living the kind of life that can lead to a flourishing outcome, especially when you're around people who are the same way, right? Like, if you're raised by parents and people around you who also have those practices, who adhere to those practices. But if you, are less conscientious and less academically oriented, and you're around people who maybe aren't the best influence, and you just have all these forces working against you, it becomes that much harder unless you have someone around you who's willing to, if you have, sort of people around you to be good role models, good parents, good neighbors, those kinds of things. I mean, even something as simple as relationships. I mean, I remember, like, I put a little bit of this in the book, but I think I would probably get canceled if I really documented in detail how teenage boys talked about girls in a place where, like, we didn't have any dads around. We didn't have any older male role models saying, like, here's what a good marriage looks like, and here's how you should treat women, and here's what you should be prioritizing. And, when it's just like, if you get a bunch of 15-year-old boys together with no role models or male father figure around, we're just going to get our cues from pop culture or music or TV or just our own dumb brain. And, that becomes the model for how we treat girls and women. And it's really not, it's not good. And so you could extrapolate from that across, like, everything, jobs, work, education, everything, if we don't have good role models in place. So yeah, it's I think it's as much of a cultural issue as it is an economic one. Yeah.
I think the reason that the Murray book Coming Apart is interesting is he realized that he fucked up with the bell curve by one chapter on race. And it's so easy. I always try to say, Like, imagine how ridiculous it is if we discriminated against everyone who had blue eyes as opposed to brown eyes or green eyes, and yet the whole racial identity and the various identitarian politics. I thought he did a great job by focusing. You know what? We're not going to look at anyone else except white Americans. Guess what? They're all fucked up too. And so this has nothing to do with race. This has nothing to do with in a fairly material way, as you yourself found in your own book, the idea that it wasn't necessarily the socioeconomic class, but it was the stability of the family unit in which the child was. I still remember I was re-looking at the manuscript, and like some of the statistics are just wild. Like you could take two kids, one they grew up in the same kind of economic class, but one kid was in foster care, and one kid was growing up with his parents. And as you point out in your book, the outcomes are really, really different, and that replicates too, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. You see this consistently. I mean, there's a sort of slew of statistics at the beginning and the end of the book. I mean, I sort of, approached this book, well, it took a while actually to sort of take the shape that it did, but eventually we sort of settled on the preface would contain a lot of the academic work, research, survey data, all of these kinds of things. And then the final few chapters also contain some of that information, but most of the bulk of the book is about my firsthand experiences. But yeah, I mean, one interesting statistic was that, so across the US overall, about 35, I think the most recent data showed 38% of US adults 25 and older have a bachelor's degree or above. So, 38% graduated from college overall. And then when you break it down by income, only 11% of kids in the bottom income quintile graduate from college. So 35% overall, only 11% for kids who grew up in poor families. But then when you look at the data for foster kids, it's only 3%. Some have shown less than 3%, but we'll say 3%. So what this means in simple terms is that if you grow up poor in America, you're 4 times more likely to graduate from college than if you spend time in foster care. And there's some other research from Amir Sariaslan at Oxford. Him and his co-authors have found that, so they analyzed data. This was from Finland. And what they found was that within the same family, so it's the same family, but in some cases, for whatever reason, one of the siblings in the family was placed into foster care, into out-of-home care, and other siblings weren't. And this could have been through, different periods of the parents' lives, something along those lines. But basically what they found was that siblings who were placed in out-of-home care were 2 to 3 times more likely than their siblings who were not placed in out-of-home care to become poor, to become addicted to substances, to be arrested, to be convicted of crimes, like all sorts of detrimental outcomes. And the researchers posited, they hypothesized that the reason for this was likely due to that sort of extreme instability early in life, which matches up with those earlier findings that I had mentioned before about the outsized role of childhood instability on a kid's life. And so, yeah, I mean, and so most kids, thankfully aren't in foster care in America. But I would say that if you were to just take the sort of modal childhood, the most typical childhood in the US today, it probably looks closer to what foster care looks like than, say, whatever, decades ago when the 1960s, say, like when Murray wrote the book. So it's not the same as foster care, but it's probably closer to that sort of instability of different siblings, step siblings. I had one friend, I lived with him and his brother my senior year of high school. So I moved out basically when I was 16. Moved in with my friend and his dad and his brother. And his dad had been married and divorced 5 times throughout their childhood. Wow. That's 5 different step families.
The triumph of hope over experience, right?
Yes, that's exactly. Yeah. I remember talking to my friend about this. Like, so the reason I was able to move in with them was because they had a spare bedroom open because the most recent step family, the stepmom and her kids from her previous marriage had moved out, and so there was a bedroom available for me where their stepbrother had formerly lived. Um, and I'm talking to them about this, and they were like, "Yeah, we just had like a whirlwind of families growing up. Like, we had our dad here the whole time. He was the kind of steady presence, but it was like every 2 or 3 years, it was another stepmom and another step sibling, and it's just a whirlwind like this." And I was like, "Yeah, it's not the same, but it's kind of similar to like the foster system, right? Just people coming and going at all, random times throughout your childhood." Um, and so, this kind of instability is, it does play a role. And so people will say, is it, how do we fix this? How do we repair this? I mean, I think that, there are probably different ways to approach it. I do think that one way is to just be more honest about it. One thing that I had this very interesting experience recently, Jim, where um, it sort of brought home for me the importance of communicating ideas, and how ideas, in addition to economic factors, cultural factors, ideas, these matter too, which is in the last about 3 or 4 months, two different readers, I've met with two different readers. Um, and basically both of them told me the same story, where they told me that, yeah, they're married, they have young children, and they were having some difficulties in their marriage. There was no abuse or mistreatment or anything like that, but they were just kind of getting bored, and they thought, oh, maybe this thing's run its course. They were having second thoughts, but they were also concerned because they had young children and about the possible effect that a divorce might have. So they were kind of on the fence about what to do. And they told me, yeah, we read something that you wrote on your Substack, or maybe something I tweeted. And basically, we've been sort of following your work, and decided to work on our marriage. And so, one person was telling me how they had enrolled in like couples counseling, and the others, they're just sort of communicating more with each other, and, they're trying to make it work. And this is just purely the result of consuming an idea, right? Like, no one gave them a paycheck. No one said like, hey, if you stay married, we're going to give you more money. This wasn't a material incentive. This was purely just whatever, scrolling their phone and looking at their Substack app. And then suddenly this changed their life. I think that when people are on the fence and they're about to make a life-changing decision, the messages they receive from people they respect, whether it's a podcast host or a writer or a thinker or just someone who, I guess, just works in the realm of ideas and has thought about these things in a maybe a deeper way than they had considered, that can actually change people's decisions. I mean, it worked for me. I mean, I talk about this in my book too, that, despite growing up in the circumstances I did, the ideas that I encountered and the people that I met, they, a lot of them did have sort of positive effects in my life.
That's a great segue, because one of the things that helped you was joining the military. Because it gave you, and specifically the Air Force in your case. And one of the things you say is that it gave you a structure and kind of a family that, you had been lacking for the first part of your life. Talk a little bit about that, and how did you make that decision? How did you, was that something that was deeply considered, or were you just lucky?
I mean, more luck. It wasn't. So I enlisted right out of high school. I was 17. I even had to have my adoptive mom. She had to sign a form for me to enlist because I was underage. I'd forged my mom's signature a bunch of times by that point already, for report cards, for permission slips, for all kinds of things. I got pretty good at forging her signature. And I thought about actually doing that to enlist, but I think I wanted her to know that I was doing it. I wanted her, it's not her permission, her approval. Because I did care what she thought, and it was important to me that she supported the decision. But anyway, so yeah, my senior year of high school, I by that point I worked two different jobs. I was working at a restaurant as a dishwasher and a busboy. And then I got a job as a bag boy at a grocery store. And in both of those jobs, I looked at my coworkers, and a lot of them were guys in their early to mid 20s, some in their 30s. And yeah, they were just like not living great lives, at least not lives that I aspired to. I mean, just I guess it's kind of cool when you're 17 to, smoke weed in your car and, just whatever, have fun and go to parties and drink and live that kind of life. But when you're 25 or 28 or 31 and you're still doing those things, especially like, there was even when I was a teenager, I did think there was something, weird about like how my older coworkers would be like willing to buy beer for me and my friends. I was like, that's weird that like, I don't know, like you'd see like the weird old guy at the high school party. And I saw that. I'm like, I don't want to be like that. Like, yeah. So, but I didn't know what else I was going to do. I mean, I wasn't in a position to go to college. I kind of knew that if I did the community college route that my friends were talking about, like there was just no way it was going to work for me. Um, I also didn't really have anywhere to live. I mean, my mom and her partner, they'd separated. There was like drama at home. Like I didn't really have anywhere else to go. Um, and so there were two different older males, guys I respected. So one was my friend's father, who I had mentioned before. I lived with him uh, my senior year of high school, and he had been in the military, and he recommended it to me. And one of my history teachers was in the Air Force, and he recommended it to me. And so, these two older male figures who I respected quite a bit, like my history teacher. One thing I liked about him is that he, like, once he accepted that I was a slacker and that I wasn't going to do the work, he would just talk to me. Like, he was like, yeah, you're kind of a wayward kid. You're not doing your homework. You sleep through class. You're kind of a, whatever. Like, clearly you're not going to put in the effort. But he would talk to me, and he could tell I was smart. Like a lot of this, the other thing is like people say we need more funding for teachers or we need more support or something. Like maybe those things are true, but teachers are usually pretty good at detecting who's smart and who's dumb, and who has academic promise and who doesn't. But just because they encourage you or notice it in you doesn't mean the kid's actually going to act on their abilities or aptitudes. Like teachers would quite frequently tell me, like, you're a smart kid. Like, what are you doing? Like, why don't you just, like, I would read the textbooks, like, I would know what they were talking about. I could keep up with the class, but the idea of doing homework or turning in science projects, any of that stuff, it just was not interesting to me. And I was also, I had a chip on my shoulder. I was an angry kid too, probably because of all those experiences that I'd mentioned. But, so anyway, this history teacher was like, look, you're not going to go to college. The military might be a good thing for you. He showed me a picture on his computer of him in his flight suit, and I was like, that looks pretty cool. And so, between those two people giving me good advice, I ended up enlisting, and I just left the summer after I graduated. I was the youngest guy in my unit in basic training, and it was probably the best decision I ever made, honestly, because it immediately got me out of the environment I was in and into a much more structured one, especially the first couple of years of a military enlistment. When you're low man on the totem pole, it's like every single aspect of your existence is tightly regulated and controlled, from how you wear your uniform to how your boots look to how you make your bed, the cleanliness of your living space, how you march, like literally everything, how you fold your clothes. And it's mind-numbing and it's dull. And I remember I sort of glossed over it in the book. Like I described like a day in the life. But like if I went through the day-to-day details, the reader would fall asleep. But I was like, here's basically what it's like. And then you just multiply this by, I was in for 8 years, Jim. It's funny. I talked to the other day, and I know that you're friends with her too, Paulina Pompliano. And and she was like telling me, Rob, when I read your book and read like what you were like when you were a teenager and I talk to you now, like it's like two different people. Like I can't even picture you being like that. And what I told her was like, I was in the Air Force for 8 years. Like that's a long time.
Yes.
And they were formative years from 17 to 25, right? Like my early adult years were in this extremely rigid environment that sort of drilled good habits into me, that taught me basically how to be a responsible person. And even though, especially the first couple of years, I actually hated it, there was more than one occasion where I thought I made a mistake because it was just so overwhelming, like suffocating, how little freedom I had in that environment, that I was like, man, I just want to go back and drink beer with my friends and play Xbox and get into trouble, go, race on the freeway or something. But this is just, this is awful. But then in hindsight, of course, I was like, best decision I ever made, and one of the things that I learned when I was in the Air Force was this distinction between self-discipline and motivation. And what I learned is that, a lot of people will say they need to feel motivated to do something. Or, I don't do that because I don't feel motivated, or I lack motivation, so I'm not going to do it. But what the military taught me was like, motivation is just a feeling. Discipline is, I'm going to do this regardless of how I feel. Like whatever's going on up here inside you, that's meaningless. What actually matters is the action you take. A simple example would be like going to the gym. I don't feel like going to the gym, but that doesn't matter. What actually matters is like, did you put your shoes on and did you go inside the gym? And in the real world, that's what matters. And so initially the discipline was imposed top down, right? Like it didn't matter if I was motivated or if I wanted to do something. The instructors were like, you're going to do this or we're going to court martial you and you go to military prison. Like those are your options. And then later it was like the discipline had been drilled into me. And so I had it inside internally. And it was like, I need to do these things because, that's more important than not doing it. And regardless of how I feel, if I just act on this thing, you multiply that over the course of a few days or a few months and good things start to happen. And so, yeah, the discipline was important. And then finally, I would say that there's also this, now I'm speaking more as a psychologist, it would be just the sort of maturity in the development over time. I cite research about the young male syndrome in the book, which is basically this finding from psychologists and criminologists that indicates that, basically the people in any society, regardless of time, place, culture, you can look at Japan, you can look at the US, you can look anywhere in the world, and you'll find that the people who are the most likely to commit crimes are young men in their late teens and early 20s. And so researchers call this the young male syndrome because that group is the most likely to take extreme risks, to commit crimes, to get involved in violent altercations, to drink and drive, to basically engage in foolhardy behaviors. But what the military did was basically remove the ability to do dumb things. I mean, you can't do them, but they make very clear that these are the consequences. And, first it's hard to act on your impulses in the first place. And then, that if you do those things, that the consequences will be swift and severe. Whereas in the real world, outside of that environment, if you're 18 years old and you're reckless and impulsive, I mean, you can drink and drive a lot before it catches up with you. You can get into a lot of fights or take a lot of drugs or sleep with a lot of strangers before the consequences of pregnancy or addiction or all of those things eventually catch up to you. But in the military, there's just, do X and Y will happen. And so, it allowed me basically to mature out of the young male syndrome years so that by the time I was in my early 20s, even if I didn't learn anything about self-discipline or camaraderie or focus or any of the things that that it equipped me with, it's still a few years that I just spent not getting into trouble and allowing myself to sort of develop mentally. And, the frontal lobes develop and you become a little bit wiser and a little bit less reckless in your behaviors. The average guy at age 22 or 24 is going to be less reckless than at age 18 or 19, which is one of the reasons why the military is set up the way that it is. I mean, it's really interesting when I think back to the the regulations, where essentially you're on base, you have to live on base. So this is the Air Force. I think the other branches have different requirements and rules, but the Air Force basically for the first 3 years, sometimes in some cases the first 4 years, you have to live on base before they let you move off. I was a weird case because I joined when I was very young and then I got promoted very fast. So I actually moved out when I was 19, which was, I mean, I got very lucky because when I was 19, I was drinking and driving and doing all of those things. I talk about how, but like I was still finding ways to bend the rules, just less less, I was behaving less in a less extreme way than I otherwise would have had I not been in that environment. I was dumb, but I was, I guess, like strategic about how dumb I was because I knew like how far I could push things and what I could get away with. Um, but generally, you can't move off till you're 21, 22 years old, which is like roughly the age that people graduate from college, right? So they kind of have this like same outlook as far as when you're mature enough to do certain things. 18 to 22, you're basically an undeveloped moron. And so we have to look at you the whole time. It's almost like you're living in a dorm room on campus. You can't do anything without someone else knowing about it. But then once you're 21, 22, you're probably a little bit less, idiotic. And so now we're going to let you move off base and be a little bit more of an adult. And so anyway, so yeah, those were some of the highlights, I guess, of the military experience.
The interesting concept about the young male syndrome, I've seen a lot of research that links that to that's when males typically have the highest testosterone in their system. And I've seen a lot of arguments made for an actual chemical cause contributing to that. And I've spent time in Africa, and it happens across the animal class too. The Africans call young male elephants naughty boys because they engage in all of the types of behavior that you just described. If you get mock charged by an elephant, it is almost always a naughty boy adolescent male. So I think that the idea of the structure of the military certainly makes sense, right? Because as you say, like the consequences for you were very severe if you did any of those crazy things. Can you imagine an alternate world? And what do you think would have happened to Rob who didn't enlist?
I mean, basically any of the outcomes that I mentioned from my friends, like those all seem plausible. I think I mentioned this before that when I was a kid, teenager too, I mean, I did have a chip on my shoulder. I had something to prove. You mentioned, yeah, testosterone's at its peak, but it was like this weird blend of, I was lifting weights, I was playing sports, and I was like in pretty good shape, but I still had this like fear in the back of my mind that people would think of me as weak. And so I was ready to fight. I mean, I write about, I don't know, 7 or 8 fist fights in the book, but there were more. I mean, those were just a few. And so, I mean, it could have been anything. Yeah, another friend of mine recently was like, yeah, I'm reading about these fights in your book. And it's like, you did get very lucky because like there was one, I write about a couple of occasions where I was getting kicked in the face when I was laying on the ground. And like, that is like very dangerous, but it was just, I was young and like lucky. And for whatever reason, those things, I didn't really get any severe injuries. I mean, like I punched someone and broke a finger and like little things like that, but I never had like really severe like head injuries or anything. What could have happened? I mean, I guess like the most likely outcome probably would have been, enrolling in a community college, probably never graduating.
Let me stop you there, because another thing that I've spoken to people about the book, and they follow you and are familiar with your ideas. I mean, what do you think about the idea that what this really is just all queuing off of general intelligence? You're obviously a very smart guy. And what would you say to the idea that, yeah, Rob, and it was the reason I asked you that question, by the way, because as I've been thinking about it and getting ready to chat with you about this, I myself just sort of speculated on, I wonder how much, if we were going to use the Occam's razor here, I wonder how much of this just ties back to your general intelligence. What do you think?
So, I mean, I understand that, and I've heard people make similar suggestions. But what I hope, I don't directly say this anywhere in the book, but I do think like, maybe it's clear that sort of raw ability is necessary but not sufficient. You can be a very smart person, but if you're in that kind, like I didn't even think of myself as smart. Like when you're never around other people who are smart, like academically inclined, none of my friends were that way. None of the people I was around. It was, it wasn't really until I got into the military that I started to meet people who were curious about things and who read books and who would have these more abstract intellectual kinds of conversations. But where I was, it wasn't like that. And, and I made this point too about how, yeah, I was smart, and I kind of knew I was smart too on some level. But I was still very unfocused in school, extremely undisciplined. I was ditching class. I just didn't have the oversight, right? Like, you could have a very smart kid, but if they don't have people around them or forces around them sort of channeling that aptitude in a productive direction, the way that I had in the military, like even things like, because you have to take tests to study for promotion in the military. And like, I had supervisors and people around me who were like, hey, how's the studying going? Like, hey, the staff sergeant test is coming up soon. Like, here's, did you get your textbook? Did you get your thing? Did you get the study guide? I didn't have anything like that when I was a kid. And honestly, even if I had, I don't know that I would have acted on it. And so, I'll just say that, like, a point that I make in my book is that my friends, no matter what upbringing they had, you can give them the best case scenario as far as childhoods. They were probably never going to go to a place like Yale. That's just the reality. But one of them didn't have to get shot to death, and the other two didn't have to go to prison. I speculate that if they had had different early lives, if they'd had different adults and different norms and different values, and sort of been raised in a different kind of situation, their outcomes, while, it may not have been astounding academic success, they wouldn't have ended up in, like, prison or dead. And so for someone like me, yes, like, the ceiling was going to a really great college and living that kind of life, but the other options were still on the table, given my environment and given the people that I was around, and the priorities that I had, and the feelings I had toward myself is something else that I address in the book too, was like, do I deserve success? Like, if you're repeatedly raised by people around you who don't treat you very well, or who don't necessarily have your best interest in mind, or who just, maybe they're kind to you in some way, but their actions fall short. You eventually sort of pick up a certain outlook about yourself and whether you deserve success or not. And that was something that I wrestled with early on too. And that was the other thing that the military was great at, was like, we don't even care if you deserve success. You just have to do it. Like, whether you want to be like, it doesn't matter what you want or how you feel about yourself. It was like, you have a mission to do. Here are the things you need to do, and just fucking do it. Like, and so, so it was, if I didn't have that, right? Like, Jim, if I didn't have those things, I don't go to Yale, like 100% guaranteed. If I hadn't been in the military, I never would have wound up there, just because I wouldn't have picked up the habits, the study habits, the discipline, the ability to stay out of trouble for long enough and stay alive long enough for that to actually be a realistic goal by the time I'm 24 or 25 years old. Maybe I would have gone to college, maybe I would have gone to Sacramento State, or, those things. It's possible. No, but I don't think it was likely. In terms of my outcome, it's anomalous, even for someone with my G and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. The other interesting thing is, it gets really hard to disentangle, because some of the behaviors that you mentioned, the laziness, the not doing assignments, not studying, there is a high correlation with high intelligence. People who are very highly intelligent tend to, even if they're growing up in a family with mom and dad are saying, go for it, son or daughter, they do tend to, as a matter of fact, I don't have a source to cite, but I read long ago that police departments used to limit the IQ of people that they hired. And there was a maximum, right? You know how the military, there's a minimum, because you literally can't train somebody to do the appropriate procedures that are, life threatening if you can't do it right. But the police department, and this was around the United States, it wasn't just one police department, had a maximum IQ. And the reason that was given was because people would say gifted IQs do not follow orders well. They do not follow procedures well. They chafe at, no, you got to do this by the book. They're like, fuck you, I got to do it by the book. You want me to find the criminal? I can do it, but this is how I'm going to do it. And it's completely outside of the norms of the police department.
So Jim, that reminds, this is a story I haven't told anyone. It's so funny. Like in the process of writing the book, so many old memories came to mind, and I would like bolt awake at 3 a.m. Like, oh, that I need to write that down before I forget. So a couple of points on the IQ and the testing thing. So first, and this is something I've explained before, was that I'm a strong advocate of standardized testing. At the moment, I'm working on a piece for the Boston Globe. Maybe by the time this episode is published, the piece will be out, basically defending the importance of the SAT and standardized testing for a variety of reasons. I mean, one is that, for me, it was like the first like hard evidence that I had as a kid that I was a pretty smart guy. So again, like my grades were terrible, but when I took the ASVAB, which is a military standardized test, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, which is, it highly correlates with IQ. It strongly correlates with the SAT. And it measures a lot of the same skills. It measures like basic literacy, arithmetic, mathematics, all those kinds of things. I took this test my senior year of high school. And I remember later going through the results with the recruiter, and he pulled up some charts basically showing me that you could convert ASVAB results into SAT scores. And he showed me the score, and I realized it was the same as one of my classmates who was going to college. Like, my classmate was a straight A student, smart, was recognized in the school as one of the smartest kids. And I was like, wow, I got the same score as that guy. By that point, it was too late. Like, I was about to graduate high school, horrible GPA, but that was the first inkling I had that like, oh, this is like evidence that I actually could have gone to college if I wanted. Later, I did take the SAT and, I was applying to colleges. But, the point there was like, basically, I think like more kids should take the SAT. People were trying to dismantle it and eliminate it and all these things. But there was this researcher, the study out of Chicago, which basically they administered an IQ test to all of the kids in this school district. And what they found was like, basically this increased the number of non-white, minority, and poor kids into the gifted programs. So basically, usually gifted programs work by recommendation from teachers or parents. And so it's purely subjective evaluation. And so these researchers administered an IQ test to every kid and basically found like a lot of these kids were being overlooked. They deserved this gifted status. But because parents are even unaware that the gifted program exists, if they're kind of low income or not really that involved in the school system or don't really know what's going on, and maybe they don't have whatever the time or the availability to monitor that their kid might actually be, extremely smart, but the test can reveal those things. The other thing is, so I remember. So right after basic training, I went to tech school. Everyone goes through this. They go to tech school. They receive training for their specific occupation. And I remember, I think it was the first test or the second test. This was like, I went through basic training, but I was still 17 and unfocused. And I think I didn't study for one of the tests. And I was like treating it like high school. Like, I'm going to wing this and see what happens. But it was actually a hard test. It was, the course was called Electronic Principles, and it was like AC/DC circuitry and all this kinds of stuff. And I was like, I didn't understand the diagram. It was like, you actually have to study this to know, you can't just bullshit your way through it. I think I failed the first or second test, just winging it, didn't study the guide. They gave us a booklet. I didn't look at it, and I failed it. And I remember there was another guy who failed it, and they immediately put him into, this is really funny. And like anyone who's in the military who listens to this will laugh, because they put him into finance, the finance occupation. So he washed out. He washed out of the electronic principles course, and they put him into the finance thing, which basically he handles people's paychecks. And the reason I think people are going to laugh is because anyone who's in the military who's ever had to deal with finance or paycheck related issues or payments or basic allowances for housing or anything, like just dealing with the finance center on the military is always a nightmare. And maybe because they put guys who can't pass EP. And so they put him in. But then I remember they pulled me aside, I can't remember the title of the person who like led the course. He was like the lead instructor, pulled me into his office, And he was like, I looked at your ASVAB score and I looked at your, basic training and I looked at everything. He looked at your record and he was like, why are you failing this like very elementary course? He's like, are you studying? Or you like, he basically like grilled me. And then at the end of it, he was like, you better fucking study. Like you can't, and I did, and I passed and everything. But I just found it like what you just said about, the military and IQ and like people being unfocused because they're too smart, this kind of thing. It made me think like because I remember like, why did they put me in the finance thing? Like, why am I getting yelled at and being pressured to pass this course when this other guy, they just washed him out and put him somewhere else? And I think it's because of this logic you're pointing out here, where they're like, okay, if you're, if you have different levels of ability, the military knows, right? Like you can pass this course, you're just lazy. And this other kid, they're like, maybe you can't pass this course. Maybe you just barely met the threshold for this occupational category and you failed very badly. And we're not going to, waste the resources and the time and the energy to put you through remedial training. So we're just going to put you into this easier job. I'm pretty sure that's what happened, through this conversation.
And that goes across all sorts of people. I myself, when I was younger, unfortunately, my oldest sister died. And one of the things that happened to me, I was 10 when she died, was that I started acting out, and, shoplifting and just not being a great kid. And so my parents moved me to the 7th grade of a newly introduced middle school at a military school. Really kind of a prep school, to be honest. We still wore uniforms and everything, but the military was not as emphasized as, like, when my dad went there, it's called St. Thomas Academy. When my dad went there, it was called St. Thomas Military Academy. And at age 18, you could graduate. Now, this is back in the 1940s. But at age 18, you could graduate into being a second Louis in the Army.
Yeah. Wow.
So it was serious.
Yeah.
Anyway, they moved me there as a discipline problem. For those not watching, I'm doing air quotes. But I shouldn't, because I really was a discipline problem. And so anyway, I was very unhappy about it. And I got all D minuses my first quarter there, or first semester there. And so they gave me, I still remember vividly, they gave me to the guidance counselor for the high school, whose name was Father Doffing. It was a Catholic school. And he gave me a series of tests, which I later learned were IQ tests. And he brought me in afterwards, and he's like, he had a very odd way of speaking. He would keep his hands together and he'd say, James, we know something about you that you probably don't know. And I'm like, what's that, Father Dopping? He said, well, I'm not going to tell you exactly, but I'm changing all of your class assignments. And so what they did was they put me in all of what at the time were called speed classes, which would be AP classes today. And in other words, kind of the same experience. Like, I did well on those tests. And my math professor, who had recommended I be, looked at by the guidance counselor, was the one who originally caught it. And it was essentially, he called me in and he's like, you know something that's funny, Jim? And I went, what's that? And he goes, you managed to get a D minus in every course that you're taking. I went, yeah, I'm dumb. And he goes, how do you manage to know exactly how you're going to pass a test with a D minus and not an F?
Right.
And I'm like, and he just looked at me and I was like, oh. But I definitely hear it in you too, though. You had people care about you. You had that guy who pulled you aside and he's like, come on, Rob, man, what's going on? And I had that too. And I wonder, that's got to be important too. But I want to leave this topic because I want to get to Yale.
Yeah. Well, just on this point very quickly. I mean, one of the things, because people talk about intelligence, we talked about it already, but that's an important piece. It's an ingredient, and it's a critical one. If you lack it, you're not going to do academically. You're not going to academically excel if you completely, if you're in the bottom, 10% or something. But the other piece is the conscientiousness piece, right? And I actually do score, I think I'm like the 80 something percentile in conscientiousness, pretty high. But one of the things that's come up repeatedly when I speak with personality psychologists, I had this conversation a while back with this guy, Brent Roberts, who's like one of the top personality psychologists in the world. And he says that the big five, they're useful, but it doesn't capture motivation. Conscientiousness can be deployed when you want to do something, but if the activity doesn't interest you, then it's not going to express itself in that way. And there's an anecdote in this book, Talent, from Tyler Cowen and Daniel Gross, which you may have encountered, which is they give this anecdotal example which helps to illustrate, which is there's this guy Vikram Seth who wrote a book called A Suitable Boy, which was like lauded, considered a masterpiece. But he was a PhD student in economics at Stanford, and he dropped out to write that novel. And his explanation, he basically said, I wrote this book because I didn't have enough conscientiousness to finish my PhD at Stanford, right? And this is like, he's obviously a conscientious person, but he just wasn't motivated to finish the PhD, but he was motivated to write this book. And so the effort and the willingness and all of those things were there for one activity, but not the other. And I think I had a bit of that too, that yes, the G and the conscientiousness, like those were in place. But when I was in high school, I didn't have the motivation. I didn't have the drive. I didn't have the self-discipline, right? I made that distinction between motivation and self-discipline. I didn't have any of those other forces working for me the way that they were later. So anyway, yes, let's, Yale, more fun stuff.
Before we get to Yale, I happen to agree with you vehemently on the idea of standardized tests because of the reason that what people are, well, you're pointing it out, but many aren't pointing it out. It is the way that kids from disadvantaged backgrounds can get into those special classes, and trying to get rid of them, you got to tie yourself in knots, right? If you're trying to say, well, they're unfair, no, they're actually helping select more kids because that is a really objective rank. So anyway, I look forward to your article. Now let's get to Yale. So tell us about that. Tell us about kind of like the cultural shock that you, my daughter graduated from Yale. My dad went to Yale. I was a legacy and could have gone to Yale, but I was a bit of a radical and didn't do that. But talk us through your introduction to Yale. I think it's fabulous.
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny. Like, there's this sort of bifurcation as far as what people's favorite chapters of the book are, and I've noticed, this is broad generalization, of course, but for early readers, I've noticed like a lot of the women tend to like the early chapters. There's a lot of emotion and a lot of pathos and so on, during my childhood experiences. But I noticed a lot of guys, especially younger guys, they like the Yale chapters. They like that sort of crazy college experience. And yeah, I mean, so I got out of the military in August of 2015. I started classes at Yale. I moved to New Haven, started classes September. And then in October, I witnessed the birth of basically a new kind of social ideological movement, this sort of resurgence of identity politics and these kinds of things. But, it was hard. Like the first few weeks at Yale, I was trying to fit in. I was an older student. I had taken some night classes at a community college before, transferred some credits in, but community college is just different. Night classes, especially, you're just in class with adults. But now I'm like literally with 18-year-olds and I'm 25 and like, a joke that I made is I actually got younger as college went on because I like shed more and more of like that military background and mindset. I just became more and more of a student. But it was like really just the first few weeks were really difficult. The coursework, I mean, this is the other thing is like, yeah, like the raw materials were there, but like, the course load was it was very intense. These schools, especially the classes that aren't filled with dogmatic political stuff, just your usual good courses by good professors, they're still very hard. The reading load, the problem sets, like it's still like difficult to get through if you're not focused and you don't have good study habits and discipline. I lack those things. And so I remember that first semester I was really struggling until I started to talk to students and talk to people about like how to approach these study strategies. I went to office hours and I was like, like like what's the best way to like get through this reading list, because you're assigning 800 pages a week and I have 4 other classes. Like, what am I supposed to do? Um, and eventually I learned there are strategies and there are ways and like methods to like basically condense the readings or collaborate with other students. And so I'll read these 200 pages, you read those 200, and we'll just share the summaries, the bullet points, so we get the main ideas, those kind of things, or collaborate in other ways. And so yeah, just as I felt like I was kind of easing into college life and kind of making friends and like kind of fumbling my way around, um, we're heading into Halloween 2015, and the Yale administration sends out this email to all of the students, basically saying, you know, be mindful of the Halloween costumes you wear. Don't engage in cultural appropriation. Don't. I have a funny story about cultural appropriation we can get to later, but don't engage in cultural appropriation. Don't be offensive. Be whatever. Be compassionate and respectful to your fellow students. Okay, so then this faculty member, this Professor Erica Christakis, who was an associate, they were still calling the master. She was an associate master at one of the residential colleges. Her husband was the master, Nicholas, who's also on the faculty. She writes an email to the students just in her residential college, kind of in response to this Yale administration email saying, do we really need the administration interfering in our lives? You're all adults. You want to wear costumes, and you find them distasteful or offensive or what have you, like communicate with each other. And she was basically defending freedom of expression and the encroachment of the university into the everyday lives of students. And the response was just incredible. Students calling for her to be fired, calling she's defending cultural appropriation, she's a racist, she's this, that, and the other. There were some famous videos of her husband, basically like in the courtyard of the college, defending his wife, defending freedom of expression, saying like, I'm not going to apologize for, the principles that she was upholding. I'll apologize. Like I didn't want anyone to feel hurt by this. But it was a weird thing in the first place to like have him apologize on behalf of his wife. I mean, even asking for that was it's kind of a retrograde attitude. The man gets to apologize for his wife. But I had a lot of difficulty even understanding what was offensive in the first place. I read the email from Erica probably 4 or 5 times, and I was like, this seems perfectly reasonable to me. Like, I don't know. Like the other thing was like, they're all just the same people to me. It was like you got the administration, you got a professor, it was like, you're all just Yale people. And like, what's upsetting about this? And I'm just like this vet who just like arrived on campus trying to like decode this. And students would get mad at me. I would ask like, can you explain to me what was upsetting about this email or what was offensive? And, some students, they were just like, you should be careful. You shouldn't ask that. Like, just people would be offended by that. And I didn't understand that. Other students got mad at me for even asking. There was one girl who said, I'm too privileged to understand the pain that Erica and her husband caused the students. And that was like, that term privileged. I mean, now I think, basically she was, judging me based on my appearance, essentially, which is, kind of ironic, because I think that ordinarily they would say you shouldn't do those things, but she was making these inferences. Oh, he's like kind of Asian looking guy, he's a cisgendered, whatever, like he's privileged, despite not really knowing anything about my background. And, I kind of came to realize like that is the campus. It was a very popular ideology on campus, was to just sort of categorize people based on what group they belong to. And, if you're a member of this group or that group, you're allowed to speak on certain things. And if you're not, then you're not allowed to speak. But then there was a lot of emphasis as well, placed on lived experience, which seemed to contradict the idea that, your social category membership dictates what you're allowed to speak about. But then they would also say, well, your lived experience is what counts. And if you live through certain experiences, then you're allowed to speak on certain things. And so I would ask, like, well, what's more important, your identity or what you actually went through in your life? Because, according to, some people on campus, I guess, I'm privileged. But then I also went through a series of lived experiences that are very different from just about everyone on campus. And, people would get mad when I would ask this question and try to figure out, like, what did eventually I just realized, like, a lot of it was not really thought through. There seemed to be kind of two different types of people who supported this way of thinking. I think one group, probably the majority group, their hearts were in the right place. They were trying to be compassionate. They were trying to, they were just basically trying not to be jerks. And if students appeared to be hurting or appeared to be upset, just, accept whatever they want and fine, move on. And then I gradually found that there was probably maybe 10 to 20% of the students and faculty and administrators on campus, probably a larger percentage of the faculty and administrators than the students, who were more kind of Machiavellian, more calculating, who were like, oh, here's this, newfangled ideology that I can use to basically get people I don't like fired, or to silence students that I don't like, and to basically advance my agenda or my interests. And I give a couple of examples in the book about how, I'd see students talk about how, investment banks are emblems of capitalist oppression and hierarchy and all these buzzwords. And then you'd see the same students at a recruitment session for Goldman Sachs. And, I think for those students, what I believe now is that they were basically trying to eliminate their rivals, right? Like, if they could convince me, investment banks are evil. Oh, they're evil. I'm not gonna apply for those jobs. Oh, good. You're not going to apply. I'm going to go apply for this Goldman Sachs job. And that's one less person, because those are very prestigious, very competitive internships. And I do think there was a bit of duplicity and a bit of sort of, inveigling and, some cloak and dagger going on there that, was surprisingly prevalent. And just the level of status anxiety I didn't expect to see. Because when I first arrived, I was like, wow, I'm at Yale. Like, considering where I came from, like, no one ever goes to Yale. Then it's like, oh, and now he's homeless, right? Like, you're going to be fine. You're going to, like, I felt like I won the lottery, basically. And in a way I did. But then I'm, looking around on campus and meeting with students and talking to people. And it's like, man, they feel like it's always the next thing. It's like, okay, now I'm at Yale. Now I need to get this internship. Now I need to go to law school. Now I need to get this job. Now I need to make this much money and do these impressive things. And it was just constant hoop jumping nonstop. No one ever felt satisfied. And, that was one of the observations that contributed later to me developing the luxury beliefs idea, was just that itch that all of these students seem to have about success and status and accomplishments, and putting all of these very ambitious drivers in one single location too. I mean, it just amplified the competitiveness even more. Granted, not all students were. I know I met good people. I met good students, good friends, like, people I'm still in touch with to this day. But the general culture on campus was just like, the message that we seemed to receive, it was this double message of, on the one hand, you're all the future leaders of the world and you're all going to do great things and you're also impressive and wonderful. But then on the other hand, especially in the wake of those campus controversies and protests, it was also like, you're so downtrodden and marginalized and oppressed and erased. And, we didn't mean to, offend you. And we know how difficult your lives are and how hard things are. And you feel unsafe and you feel traumatized, blah, blah. And I'm like, so what is it? Like, is this the future ruling class? Are these like, the future, whatever, 1%ers? Or are we just like a bunch of, traumatized, hurt, sad people who are, being bullied because this one professor wrote, basically a normal email? Like, so anyway, it was just a very rocky start. But that was my introduction to the campus culture. And it wasn't just Yale. This was 2015, 2016. I was seeing similar kind of phenomena at other universities too. While I was at Yale, I worked for this organization called Service to School, which was basically geared toward partnering veterans who were currently in college with people who were applying, applicants, veterans who were trying to get in. And so I was working with this guy. In the book, I call him Daniel, and he was a former Marine. He had a very difficult life, arguably more difficult than me. I mean, he was this Black dude who grew up in, his mom was addicted to crack, and his dad, I think it was in prison, just like really tough early life. And so, he joined the Marines, turned his life around. He and I worked together. He ended up getting into Brown, and he was a Marine, right? Like, he was a very patriotic guy. And when he arrived on campus in 2016, he, on Veterans Day, he did not expect to see a bunch of college students burning the American flag. And he called me and he was like, yo, is this happening at Yale too? Like, this is fucking crazy. And they weren't burning flags at Yale, but, like veterans, was like there was a question mark over, some people really liked vets, others didn't. But as far as like celebrations for Veterans Day, they would have like little events and stuff. But I'll just say that, like, if someone were to burn flags at Yale's campus, it would be, a shock. I think Yale was a little bit, Brown has a reputation, right?
Yeah.
I think Yale has a reputation too.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Brown's got more of a reputation.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I tried to talk him through this, and I was like, yeah, like, he just, I didn't, I don't know. I didn't talk to him about the politics and all of this stuff that was happening, because I could tell he had the same kind of, innocent, hopeful aspirations about what college would be like, the same ones that I did the year prior. And I didn't want to burst his bubble. And I'm like, just telling him about the positive stuff. But so he was unprepared. I was unprepared for it. But like, now everyone knows, right? Like, all of this stuff is kind of spilled out of the university campuses, and like everyone knows what's happening now. But, that, 8-9 years ago, it was still very much a sort of campus phenomena. I know Andrew Sullivan wrote this, it's a famous post where we all live on campus now. But in 2015, people on campus lived on campus. And, now we're sort of seeing, what happens when it sort of seeps throughout the culture.
One of the things that I was going to ask you is, like, especially in terms of luxury beliefs, I'm wondering how much this is not so much an upper class versus lower class phenomenon, but rather a political division, because there's lots of upper class people who don't share any of those luxury beliefs, nor do they signal them the way you point out. A classically leftist person might do that. I think Machiavellian and competitiveness, that is across the political spectrum, right? I'm always reminded of Oliver Stone's 1987 movie Wall Street. And of course, if you know Oliver Stone, he's a very classic left-wing guy, and actually was making the movie to, indict Wall Street and indict the behavior and dissuade young people from going into Wall Street. And of course, it turned out to be the greatest recruiting film Wall Street ever could have.
Yeah.
And so, because you yourself are if I was just going to be devil's advocate, I would say, Rob, you are a classic example of a meritocracy actually working. You got into Yale, you got into Cambridge, which, for those who aren't familiar, Oxbridge, which is Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, are the equivalents of our Ivies. They would argue that our Ivies are the equivalents of Oxbridge. But any thoughts on that? Because, in one way, we could look at you as the poster boy of meritocracy and it working. And then the other thing that I want you to address is, do you find any irony at all that your article on luxury beliefs appeared in the house organ for left-wing intellectuals, the New York Times?
So the luxury beliefs article, I don't think I the New York Times never ran. So they have published some of my essays before. But the luxury beliefs articles, one was in the New York Post, one was in Quillette, and one was in the Wall Street Journal. So I guess, it's, the Wall Street Journal is kind but I guess they're generally seen as being to the right of the New York Times. But I mean, like the general point,
well,
I understand.
But these days, kind of Pravda is to the right of the New York Times.
Fair enough. It's these are good questions. So is the luxury beliefs idea, I mean, is it more political than class? I don't think so. I mean, the way that I define luxury beliefs, ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent while inflicting costs on the lower classes, to a large extent, it does overlap with political views, but that's just because, by the time I arrived on campus in 2015, there was this like shift politically such that more and more college-educated people, especially more and more sort of white college-educated people, were shifting to the Democrats in large numbers in a way that, historically, I think white college-educated Americans tended to, statistically be more likely to support Republicans. But by this point, especially 2016 election and onward, it's been shifting. And then especially at elite universities, I mean, it's funny, like the luxury beliefs, even when you just look at universities themselves, Eric Kaufman's done some interesting work on this, where the more elite the university, the more ideological they are, the more they are likely to espouse luxury beliefs. And then the sort of mid-tier and lower ranking universities are less likely to espouse them. And so, it overlaps with politics, but it really is, to me, a class-driven phenomenon. I mean, I was raised for a good portion of my childhood by working class Democrats. They don't buy into a lot of this bullshit. I mean, and then when you look at the survey data, working class Democrats are just like less likely to support, all kinds of, defund the police is one that I focus on a lot in the book, is that when you break down the defund the police, like who supported defund the police, the vast majority of Democrats and Republicans both didn't want to do this. But then when you break it down by income category, the people who were the most supportive of defunding the police were the Americans in the highest income category, and the people who were least supportive were those in the lowest income category. And then when you break it down by education as well, college graduates, and especially people with postgraduate degrees, were the most likely to support defunding the police relative to people whose highest level of education was a high school diploma. And so, there are other, examples of this as well. But essentially, I think it is more, and it's not just purely income-based, it's class-based, right? And class also encompasses education, whether you have a parent who went to college, like those kinds of things too, sort of a culture in your outlook. And so, yeah, the luxury beliefs are, it's a sort of social scientific framework. So of course, naturally, it's not going to apply to every single person in a given category. That's just the way these things work. There are sort of correlations, but I have friends who are affluent and who are very much against the luxury beliefs idea. And I'm sure that you can find people who are working class or who don't have high levels of education who have some sympathy or support for these things. But whenever I discuss the luxury beliefs idea in my writing, I do draw on survey data, which does indicate that, sort of the more education and the more money someone has, regardless of their political party. I mean, there are Republicans who are high earning, who have lots of education, who also have luxury beliefs. And they're far more likely to have luxury beliefs than a working class, non-college educated Republican. And then to your other point about the, am I the poster boy for meritocracy? I mean, I actually do think that, for the most part, we live in a meritocracy. I think like this is kind of a myth that people have propagated, which is like, to some extent, there are barriers in place, but generally, people who aren't like ideologically addled, who are in sort of gatekeeping positions, they actually, when they meet someone who's capable and talented from a marginalized background, who has managed to achieve a bit of success, like they want to help. A lot of people, I mean, this is like, and I think it's actually a uniquely American trait, this like willingness. I mean, obviously other cultures have this, but to me, it's like more pronounced in American culture that you meet people who are just generous and friendly and kind and want to sort of help people who need it and who are willing to work hard. And so, but there are limits to this meritocracy idea. And I talk about this in the book too, that, not everyone not everyone is equipped to go to college. And I don't just mean financially, just some people, it's just not their thing. I had friends who, they weren't dumb, but they just weren't classroom oriented people who enjoyed learning from books. And so it is great that our system does a pretty good job of finding smart kids. Not perfect, but they do a pretty good job of finding kids who are smart and talented from communities that are not doing well. And they try to put them on a track or give them a scholarship or try to find ways to get them onto that upward mobility track. But in the book, I talk about this idea. I think in the book, I call it trickle-down meritocracy. I've also called it trickle-down diversity, which is this idea that what the elite institutions in America do is they strip mine smart, talented, capable people out of their communities and reshuffle them into elite universities. And Murray's talked about this in some of his work too, and other researchers have too, which is like, if you're, a working class or poor kid from Red Bluff, California, or from Ohio or whatever, and somehow you manage to get into Stanford or Harvard or whatever, those, I'm not going to go back to Red Bluff. The kid from Ohio isn't going to go back to Ohio. Where do we tend to cluster in places like San Francisco or New York or Boston or these sort of metropolitan areas that are economically attractive and lucrative. People who, they get a degree, they want to receive the financial remuneration. And so, in a perverse way, I think meritocracy, the more effective it is, the more polarization you'll see by class, by background, by academic abilities. People, I'm sure you're familiar with this term, many of the listeners do, about brain drain, about people who, people who are talented or academically equipped will leave their communities behind. I see this in, like, whenever I visit home, when I go back to Red Bluff, California, I see it more and more that any smart, ambitious kid is just going to go off to college. Any smart and ambitious kid who was like me and didn't do well in school, they join the military, they just get out of there. No one wants to stay there because there aren't that many opportunities. And so gradually what meritocracy does is it sort of creates this system of, pipelining people, out of these areas and into major cities and fancy universities. And then we have smart people clustering in major cities who think that the path to doing well in life is to just have a big brain and do well in school. And the people who make education policy and social mobility policy tend to be nerds who are really good at school. And they just assume that everyone can be a nerd and be good at school if we just twist the dials of society just right. And, this is probably why there's this lack of attention and resources channeled to things like the trades, things like other avenues for living a satisfying life where you can earn a decent living, and people can find ways to live a satisfying life that don't involve, getting a creative and interesting, high-paying white-collar job. This was a point that I made in my original Luxury Beliefs essay in the New York Post, which is that the vast majority of Americans don't have professions. They have jobs. They have a job like the kind that I had in high school, where you clock in and clock out. You get paid by the hour, and that's it. And for people like that, how do you, as a society, we could think more about how to create sources of meaning and fulfillment for those people. And instead, like what were those sources of meaning? Relationships, marriage, family, kids, maybe your local church, your religious community, giving back to your neighborhood, those kinds of things. And there's very little attention paid to those other sources of meaning. And instead, the whole idea of flourishing and upward mobility, it's like, people like me, or people who did good in their education, got good grades or got fancy degrees from an expensive university. And then we decide that that's the model for what a good life looks like, is just going to college and getting a high-paying job. And for most people, that's just not in the cards for them. And we could think more about how to, like, it's great that we found ways to make life better for someone like me. But I'm a point, that I try to make, at least implicitly in my book, is like, how do we also find ways to make life better for people like my friends that I graduated high school with?
Right. And the other interesting thing to me is you in a relatively short period of time, like looking at America in the early 20th century, you could have a situation where you could have a brilliant baker and an idiot banker, and the family's location in society determined pretty much who was going to be which, right? So brilliance didn't get you the ticket that you got because of other social norms that were dominant during the time period. And then what we noticed was, as meritocracy emerged, it affected things downstream too, because it used to be that the idiot banker could be married to a brilliant woman, and the brilliant baker could be married to the average woman, etc. But one of the things that we found being correlated as merit emerged and people started getting opportunities to go to Yale, Harvard, et al., was they started marrying other smart people. And then what happened was, intelligence is highly heritable. And so you essentially created sort of a new group of people. And that was happening specifically at a time when the information economy was emerging. And so for the really first time in terms of just pure correlation, intelligence, especially the ability for abstract intelligence and reasoning, became a winning ticket in business, in trading, in everything. And so you see this new group of people emerging, and basically, like, if you want to speculate about it, it's like, are we creating a genetic hierarchy here? Because the brilliant people getting married to other brilliant people produce brilliant children, and gosh, we're in an economy where brilliant people can invent a wonderful app and become a centimillionaire. And then you've got both the money and the brilliance. You see any, does that worry you?
It used to. When I first started learning about that and sort of learning about assortative mating and heritability and intelligence and these kinds of things, I did wonder that, is this, and technology has changed things so much, like you said, like in the past. I mean, there's sort of the cultural component, the universities opening up their doors to more people, and then the ease of geographic mobility too, that, even if you did, if you lived in the Midwest and you got into Harvard in, 1930 or something, like, how are you going to get to Boston? And, you had a family, and, there was just like expectations. The economy was in a place such that, if you were an able-bodied young man, like, you had to help your family before you went off to college. And so all of these transformative factors. But I read some work from the economic historian Greg Clark, he's written a few books. The Sun Also Rises is the one that I read relatively recently, and he basically, he analyzed data from various societies: the U.S., England, Sweden, Japan, various different societies. So the Sun Also Rises, SON, meaning, so he analyzes surnames across history, dating back to, I think in the case of England, something like the year 1100 or 1200. And he basically, because he was looking at Oxbridge, and he was like, has social mobility changed since Oxbridge has basically opened up their doors, and it's not just, the aristocrats and the ruling class go into these places. And he basically finds almost no change in social mobility over time, no real change in assortative mating. And he does this through various ways. One way that he looks at this question is to look at, so of course, women couldn't go to university until fairly recently, historically. And so people often point to this example of, like, in the 1950s, a business executive would marry his secretary. And this is an example of sort of cross-educational mating, non-assortative mating. Whereas now, the executive marries the other, another executive. But Greg Clark looks at, he correlates the social position of the male and the social position of the woman's father, and basically finds, consistently it's almost the same. So if it's an executive marrying the secretary, the secretary's father was probably an executive or probably something similar, roughly in the same social class or category as the man his daughter's marrying. And he basically finds this example throughout the centuries, and he suggests that people are pretty good at kind of sizing up who their match is, even if they don't have the external badges or the trappings of education, for example. Like, oh, I have a bachelor's degree and you have a bachelor's degree, therefore we're a match. He suggests that historically, people just have conversations with people and can kind of tell, like, are you dumb or are you smart? Like, are we a match? Just through conversation, just through our tastes, through our habits, through our interests. And in that way, in that sense, I'm almost like, yeah, that's interesting that, even if more and more people go to college, or there's this, there's a growing gender gap, more and more women are going to university than men, that maybe, initially I was concerned about this, but, I think like, even if more women are going to college, or even if things are changing and more people, the brain drain phenomenon, I think like somehow people may actually be pretty good at finding their match. And that, if you believe Greg Clark and his work, that things aren't really going to change all that much, that people are who they are, they mate with who they're going to mate with. But again, like, he's looking at data from more or less, some of the data is pretty recent, I think up until like 2000 or 2010. But I just think technology has changed so dramatically since the mid 20th century that, it's like the worries that you and I have, like, those may actually be completely valid, and we just haven't sort of seen the full effect yet. So we'll see.
Yeah. Final question. I could talk to you forever, and I'm noticing I'm getting the hook from several of our producers. They're like, Jim, shut up. But it seems to me, and I would love your take on this, that kind of the Overton window is changing. What happened recently at the Ivies with Harvard in particular. It was kind of like public knowledge versus private knowledge, right? Where everyone kind of knows, but then something happens and everyone in the public is, and they jump on the thing. The inartful communication, they brought it on themselves, right?
Oh,
but in the past, I don't know that, for example, President Gay would have been forced to resign at Harvard, and now she's gone. And do you think that the Overton window is changing a bit as these things, as you said, quoting somebody else, that everybody lives on campus now?
Yeah, I agree. I think like 3 or 4 years ago it would have been unthinkable for President Gay at Harvard to be fired or pressured to resign. So things are changing. And it's nice to see, because people have been talking about this for a while. Like, basically ever since 2015, people are saying, people are finally realizing the madness of the campus, and people are finally realizing, and I think like it's actually true now. It's kind of a cliche at this point, 8, 9 years later, but I think it is the case. There's hard evidence of this now. The president at Penn also resigned. People are saying like something is happening here. This identity politics stuff, this, the oppressor oppressed, like anti-Semitism being condoned on campus is, that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. But now we're at this point now where, it's just, it was unbelievable to see it. And so, the Overton window, I think, is changing. It's shifting. People are a bit more open and honest. And people have been, like you said, like there's this sort of preference falsification. There's people have been kind of quiet and worried about, oh, should I say this? Should I not? But now, there's been these very public events and people finally feel completely free to speak out. I feel it too. There've been a couple of things. Leaving Cambridge, finally getting my degree and not being tied to any particular institution has been very liberating. And yeah, I do like to think that, you know, I think if you are in a position to do so, I understand like everyone has different risk profiles. If you are a professor and you have mouths to feed and you have a family, and you don't want to lose your job, then yes, of course, like your risk profile is different. But if you're, you're like me, relatively young and you don't have kids and you make your living in a way that is kind of, shielded from the vagaries of social media, then yeah, I've been trying to point out some of these things for a while. And, I think it's has some non-trivial effect if everyone collectively starts to tell the truth. And I think like that did have some non-trivial effect on sort of the shifts around campus that we're seeing now and, sort of realizing what's been happening and finally coming to our senses. So, I mean, they're not perfect. I don't really see, the universities are still in not a great place. I think the president of Yale got very lucky. Like, just briefly. So Peter Salovey at Yale, I mean, he was the president when I was there too. But he, so somehow there was a story about how he almost went to that hearing, but like somehow didn't have to go. I don't remember the exact reasoning, but right at like the day after the hearing, like the Yale Daily News approached him. Like, what did you think of the hearing? What did you think of, the president at Harvard and Penn and so on and so forth? And he basically gave this like very, sort of milquetoast, like, yeah, I mean, basically agreeing, but like not fully committing to it. Like, well, they had some interesting things to say, and it's true, like, harassment or bullying, and it depends on the terms and the terminology, and play the word game. And then like once he saw, the public outcry and the backlash, and the president at Penn resigned immediately, or like the day after or something. And then they reapproached Salovey at Yale, and he was like, "Oh, it was horrible. I completely condemn anti-Semitism." And, so he's like, just sort of where does the wind blow? Oh, I have to go. It's like because when you're the president of an elite institution like that, you are like 50% politician, and so I kind of understand it. But it's just that the fact that he was like that and he was just sort of bending to the wind. It's that's still. This stuff still exists on campus, and then it's going to take like more of a concerted effort. But what we're seeing, at least to start.
Yeah. Do you have another book in the works?
I mean, I don't have anything on paper in terms of writing or contract. But if this book does well, and if there's interest, then I would like to do some kind of luxury beliefs book. It would focus on luxury beliefs, but just a sort of a summary, a kind of a tour of status and signaling theory, prestige and dominance, interest in power, the dark triad, the light triad, just to basically like some of my idiosyncratic taste and interest in psychology. If I could find a way to market that into a luxury beliefs book, I think I would enjoy that, but we'll see, one book at a time.
That would be fun. Well, listen, I'm always have a great time when I talk to you. I'm going to give you, this will be how many times that you get to be the emperor of the world. You're going to see just through sheer number alone, you're going to be the actual emperor of the world. So the rules. You can't put anyone in you can't act like an Ivy League, and you can't have thought police and indoctrination camps, but you can whisper something into a magic microphone and incept all 8 billion people with 2 thoughts. They're going to wake up the next day. They're going to think that their idea was theirs. What are you going to incept in the world's population?
Well, I'm glad that I actually prepared for this one, because I've been listening to your show for a while now. I think at least a couple of occasions in the past I was unprepared, but I'm just going to go with a couple of the lessons that I learned. So I did a Twitter thread, and it was later sort of published in a more formal sort of format in the Free Press. Lessons I learned, and 2 of the more important ones that I listed. So one was that your choices shape your identity, not the other way around. And the idea here being that I think some people, they start out from this position of I'm a member of this category, that I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a man or a woman or what have you, and therefore I have to believe XYZ, and therefore these are the actions that I'll take. But instead, one thing that I've learned is it's actually the other way around. It's what you do matters, not whatever identity category you belong to, and that's sort of over time, your decisions and your actions, that shapes what your identity is, and not necessarily in terms of the categories we normally think about. And then the other is that, a lot of the things that happen in our lives are not our fault. But how we live our life is still our responsibility. A lot of people and a lot of members of the luxury belief class, I think, they like to point out or try to justify or excuse, if you had this kind of life or that kind of life or went through these experiences, somehow that exonerates you from having to still be like a good person and at least strive towards, trying to improve your life and the lives of those around you. And so that was another lesson I learned. So yeah, that responsibility and your choices, I think those are important things to keep in mind.
I love those too. It's a shame that I gave you a shot to prepare. So, but those are great. And the book is available everywhere.
Yes.
And I highly recommend buying a copy. I think it's a great book. So thanks for taking the time with us, Rob, and best of luck on the books. And next time you're on, we'll probably have Trung and we'll be arguing about some movie.
Yes. I'm looking forward to it. Sounds great.
All right.